In the glittering heart of a royal palace, a young maid steps into a world where every glance is measured, and every secret could be her ruin. When the prince, accustomed to having all he desires, moves to claim a kiss, she meets him with a warning that halts him in his tracks. If you kiss me, you'll regret it. What begins as defiance ignites a dangerous game of pursuit, where power, pride, and an unspoken truth threaten to change both their destinies forever. The morning had the brittle chill of early March, the kind that seeped beneath wool and bone. Mist hovered over the road as the carriage rattled past the last hedgerows, and the Palais de Valmont rose into view like a vision engraved in gilt and frost. Céleste Duret pressed her gloved hands together and stared, as if staring might steady the uneven tempo of her breath. The palace sprawled across the gentle slope north of Paris, all pale stone and long windows winking faintly with reflected light. The world here seemed measured and precise, from the clipped yew trees to the symmetrical flights of steps, as if even nature had been asked to mind its manners. At the gates, liveried guards admitted the carriage with the indifference of those who see splendor daily. The courtyard within was already awake, ringing with the controlled bustle that prefaced a grand evening. Footmen crossed from one wing to another with crates of crystal, a gardener shook dew from cut branches destined for flower arrangements, and a line of scullery boys hurried toward the service entrance, faces pink from the cold. Nothing dawdled, nothing lingered. Even the pigeons took wing as if following unspoken orders. When Céleste's boots touched the stone, her legs felt at once too light and too heavy. She lifted her trunk only a few inches, before a maid with rolled sleeves and quick hands relieved her of it, nodding toward a low door tucked beside an arch. Inside, the air warmed and thickened with familiar scents: soap, starch, beeswax, the faint roast of something turning on a spit far away. A bell rang from some hidden corridor, its note crisp as a pebble dropped in water, and Céleste's guide moved faster. They wound down a passage whose walls bore genteel scars, arras of polish upon polish, small nicks with softened edges, until the corridor widened and disgorged them into the servants' hall. Madame Lefebvre was waiting there as if she had anticipated the exact second Céleste would arrive. Her presence drew the frenetic energy of the room into neat lines. She was not tall, yet everything about her seemed unwavering, from the straight set of her shoulders to the clean knot of her dark hair. She could have been carved from discipline and dressed in authority. Without flourish or welcome, she looked Céleste over, not unkindly but thoroughly, as though inventorying a new addition to a well-ordered household. Céleste stood very still. She knew better than to fill silence with explanations. She kept her eyes at a respectful level and wondered if Madame Lefebvre could hear how fast her heart was moving. The housekeeper's instructions came in a clear, efficient stream. Duties would begin at once. The palace was receiving an ambassador that night, and every inch of marble and velvet must reflect the dignity of the host. There were linens to be boiled and pressed, fires to be tended in rooms that had not seen guests in months, stair-runners to be beaten and returned before anyone from the upper floors set a foot on them. Much would be asked, and little would be said about it. Here, one worked as if the walls themselves were watching. When Madame Lefebvre spoke of the private quarters, however, she paused long enough for emphasis to cool the air. Discretion was not a suggestion, but a rule cemented by the very foundations. Those who kept their observations to themselves thrived. Those who did not drifted away and were not spoken of again. Céleste felt the meaning of that settle like a cloak, too heavy to shrug off, too necessary to refuse. Then came the first task. Céleste was to deliver fresh linens to the rooms of Prince Adrien de Valmont, and to ensure that the bed linen and table napery were of the correct number and fold. She was told which corridor to take, which door to use, and at what angle to set the newly laundered pile, so the prince's valet could reach it easily, without disturbing the arrangement of the room. The words themselves were simple. The weight carried behind them was not. Céleste accepted the stack of linen, warm still from the press, its edges sharp with starch. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender water, a luxury meant to be noticed only if one was of the rank to notice such things. Cradling the pile carefully, she made her way from the tucked bustle of the servants' hall to the first of the palace's grand galleries. Here, sound changed. The floors were parquet, intricate geometric patterns that seemed almost too fine to be stepped upon. Every footfall sent a muted echo ahead, and every echo sounded like an announcement. Tall windows ran the length of the hall, their panes catching a sky the color of pearl. Heavy frames held oil portraits whose eyes followed a person's progress in a way that felt personal. Celeste walked the measured line down the center, conscious of the straightness of her spine, the steadiness of her hands. She had never needed to breathe more quietly. From beyond a closed door came a brief hum of stringed instruments, a rehearsal, she thought, for the evening's entertainment. She smelled oranges and cloves where a tray of pomanders had just been carried past, the scent clean and bright against older, deeper aromas, the polish on the banister, the faint ash of a grate recently swept. The palace spoke a language of small details. Celeste listened because she had to, and because it steadied her to make sense of the place by the things it chose to emphasize. She reached the long gallery that led to the prince's apartments and paused, just for a heartbeat, at the threshold. The air here held another temperature, subtler than warmth or chill, a refinement that seemed to press against the skin like a glove. The door at the end stood open by a fraction, the gap no wider than a thumb. Through it, sunlight fell into the room beyond in a slanting sheet, catching dust motes and making tiny constellations of them. She had been told she might not see the prince himself, that he would be occupied with matters of state and ceremony. That possibility hovered, as a small mercy. She drew another breath and went on. Inside the anteroom, the quiet was different again. Close. Attentive. She crossed to a side table and set the linens down exactly where she had been instructed, aligning the edges with the grain of the wood. The pile settled with a faint sigh, a whisper against the polished surface. She smoothed the top with one palm, fingertips catching on the crispness of the fold. For a moment she allowed herself to look, truly look, beyond the task to the room itself. The windows were tall enough to make the outdoors feel like a painting. Light rested on everything, gilding the curve of a chair leg, the fine filigree of a clock's casing, the embroidery of a ceremonial coat draped carelessly over the back of a chair as if someone had shrugged it off mid-thought. The coat drew her gaze. The thread, gold and subtle, caught the sun and held it in tiny, patient flames. It could not be touched. That was a rule that needed no stating. But she felt the pull of it anyway, a small tug of wonder. Her hands returned to her sides. She took a step backward. Another. The quiet pressed more firmly now, as if the room were holding its breath along with her. She turned, and the white frame of the open door widened in her periphery. She could leave as soundlessly as she had come. She imagined walking the length of the gallery again, the portraits watching, the music a rumor at the edge of hearing. The doors closed, not slammed, closed with deliberation, two halves meeting with the soft finality of a secret being decided. The sound reached into her and plucked at something taut. She pivoted so fast that the hem of her dress rasped against the floor, her pulse lifting and punching at her throat. The room was the same, and not the same. The light still lay across the carpet, but it seemed to lie heavier. He was there, close enough that the air around him felt changed, as if it understood it had been tasked with carrying his presence and had become denser for the honor. He did not move to the side or dip his head in courteous apology. He simply occupied the doorway, precise and unmoving, and in doing so, he occupied the exit as well. His attention fixed on her, as if fastening a clasp. Celeste did not drop her gaze. Her training had always said to look a little lower, to blend into the margin of the page rather than the center. But there was no margin in a room like this, and the page would not turn until someone moved. The scent of starch lifted from the linen behind her. The clock on the mantel ticked with exaggerated calm. Somewhere far off, the echo of a bell clipped the hour, sounding oddly cheerful in a room that had entirely forgotten how to be at ease. She felt the beat of her heart in her palms, in the base of her throat, in the soft places where a person could not be armored. Her mouth was dry. Her mind, for once, did not run ahead to consequences. It could not. It stayed here, held by the fact of him and the shape of this closed space, and the unblinking knowledge that nothing would turn frivolous if she pretended it might. His gaze did not waver. The coat with its patient flames hung where it had hung. The light reached no farther than it had before. It was the same moment remade, threaded now with an awareness that had not been asked for and could not be put down. The prince took a step forward, his gaze unyielding, and said in a low voice, "I don't believe we've met." Prince Adrian's voice carried the sort of quiet authority that made refusal feel like a breach of protocol. The words were not a question so much as an opening to something he had already decided would occur. He stood with a composure that suggested leisure, though every inch of him was aware, deliberate. The white shirt he wore hung open at the collar, the faint V of skin catching the light. The sleeves were rolled once, just enough to expose the sinew in his forearms, the movements of his hands as unhurried as if time itself bowed to his will. Celeste's fingers curled slightly at her sides. The air in the room was no different than it had been moments ago, yet it pressed warmer against her skin, carrying a faint current of his cologne, an understated blend of bergamot and something darker. The weight of his gaze traveled over her like a slow inspection, taking in the unadorned dress, the neatly pinned hair, the measured stillness she maintained as though it were a form of armor. He began to circle her with a step so silent the floorboards might have been holding their breath. The faint creak of his leather boots was softened by the thick carpet. The sound swallowed almost before it reached her ears. Celeste kept her eyes forward, allowing herself only the smallest turn of her head to follow his movement. Her pulse quickened despite her resolve, each beat an insistent reminder of the closeness she could not control. The room itself seemed to conspire with him. Sunlight from the tall windows pooled in long golden stripes on the floor, and in one of these he stepped, the light touching his cheek, outlining the straight bridge of his nose and the faint, unshaven shadow along his jaw. His voice, when it came again, was low and even, threaded with a curiosity that felt less like idle interest and more like a quiet demand. He asked where she was from, how long she had been in the palace, though each question landed not as a request for knowledge, but as a measure of her reaction. Her replies were short, careful, the sort of answers that gave nothing more than they were meant to give. She could not read his thoughts entirely, but she felt the way his attention sharpened at certain pauses, as though mapping out the places she chose to leave silent. The music from the distant ballroom reached them in faint swells, a waltz slowed by the thickness of the walls, and the sound seemed to underscore the deliberate rhythm of their exchange. His gaze flicked toward the pile of linens she had set on the table, but it was a glance in passing, quickly returned to her face. The faint southern lilt in her speech seemed to have caught his notice, for the corner of his mouth lifted in something between amusement and intrigue. He made a remark about it, one she could not quite categorize as compliment or warning, and then closed the space between them with the ease of someone accustomed to having the path cleared before him. The sunlight shifted fractionally as a cloud passed outside, dimming the room into something more private, less touched by the world beyond these walls. Celeste's hands remained steady, though the warmth in her chest betrayed the calm she attempted to keep. She was aware of the way his height cast her in partial shadow, the faint rustle of fabric as he adjusted his stance. His eyes held the kind of confidence that presumed she would not move unless he allowed it, and the longer she stood before him, the more the air felt like a net drawn close. A glint of something, not quite impatience, not quite play, appeared in his expression, as though he had tested her composure long enough and found it both vexing and compelling. His gaze dropped briefly, not to the linens, but to the faint rise and fall of her breath. Then, without any shift in tone or posture, he closed the final inches between them. The nearness was startling in its quietness. No grand gesture announced it. It was simply there, his presence filling the narrow space, his shadow mingling with hers. She could feel the heat that rose from him, the subtle movement of the air as he drew in a breath. For a moment, nothing in the room moved except the pendulum of the mantel clock, its slow, metronomic swing marking the seconds with deliberate patience. Her mind searched for a path out of the moment, words that could disperse the intensity, steps that could create the distance she knew she needed, but none presented themselves quickly enough. He leaned closer, his face angling so the line of his jaw passed within a breath of hers, and she could see, in sharp clarity, the tiny flecks of gold in his irises. The faintest shift in his expression told her he had already decided how this moment would end. She felt the air stir between them as his mouth drew nearer, the light catching briefly on the curve of his cheekbone. The scent of him deepened, warmed by proximity, the edges of the bergamot giving way to the darker notes beneath. Her back remained straight, her chin level, though her heart pressed insistently against her ribs. The silence grew heavier, the world beyond the door falling away until there was only the steady sound of her own breathing and the poised, deliberate movement of his approach. He leaned in, his mouth inches from hers, and murmured, "I think I shall take what I want." For a suspended heartbeat, the room felt soundless, as if the air itself hesitated to move. His words seemed to linger, deep and certain, a private decree no one else could hear. The shadow of his breath touched her skin before his lips did, carrying with it the faint heat of something unyielding. Celeste did not step back, though every instinct urged her to create distance. Instead, she lifted her chin by the smallest measure, enough to meet his gaze directly. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that surprised even her, low enough to draw him closer in order to hear. She told him, without tremor or plea, that if he kissed her, he would regret it. The words were as sharp and cool as the March air outside, cutting through the charged quiet like a blade drawn clean from its sheath. The effect was immediate. Adrian stilled, his nearness unchanged, but his eyes narrowed with something more than curiosity. It was not a look she could easily read, no single shade of emotion, but a blend, a flicker of intrigue, a touch of disbelief, and a thread of irritation at being refused without explanation. His hand, which had hovered near the edge of her sleeve, did not close the distance. The clock on the mantel ticked again, and the sound seemed louder now. Beyond the tall windows, a pale shaft of sunlight caught on the glass, glinting before a passing cloud dulled it. His gaze roamed over her face as though searching for the point where her resolve might crack. She gave him none. A silence settled between them, heavier than the one before, and Celeste felt the weight of it pressing along her shoulders. The scent of polished wood, beeswax, and the faint lavender from the linens was almost stifling in its stillness. She wondered briefly if she had gone too far, but only briefly. Whatever trouble her words might stir, the alternative was worse. At length, Adrian drew a slow breath and stepped back, the movement controlled, deliberate, without the suddenness of retreat. His gaze never left her, as though the space between them had not erased the impact of what had just passed. The faintest curve touched his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like a mark of acknowledgement, or perhaps a promise that this was not finished. Celeste took the opportunity to turn, reclaiming her focus on the folded linens, lifting them again with practiced care. She intended to walk to the door, to cross the gallery and leave him behind for the rest of the day if possible. But before her hand touched the door frame, his voice sounded again, quieter this time, carrying a weight that seemed to follow her into the hallway even before she stepped there. The words were not a question. They were an assertion, one that trailed after her like a hand that had not been physically laid but was felt nonetheless. The prince told her, in the same tone he might use to announce a future certainty, that one day she would explain exactly why he would regret it. The phrase chased her into the gallery, the polished floor gleaming beneath her steps. She did not look back. The air in the corridor was cooler, its draft a muted relief against the warmth she had left behind. Farther down, the sound of brisk footsteps and the soft scrape of a cart's wheels announced the presence of other servants. She merged into the rhythm of the palace's work without allowing her pace to quicken. Yet even as she carried the linens toward the next task, she was aware of the echo of that closed room, the stillness, the proximity, the moment where choice and defiance had collided. And though she forced her breathing into an even cadence, the awareness lingered in her chest, as if the encounter had left an imprint too deep for the passage of a single corridor to erase. She could not know whether his smirk had been the end of the matter or the beginning. The palace seemed to hum faintly around her, the vibrations of movement and purpose hiding in the walls, in the small sounds of work continuing as though no one inside had paused to listen to anything but orders. And yet, beneath the surface, she felt it. The same poised quiet as before a door closes. One day, you'll explain to me exactly why I would regret it. The rest of the morning unfolded in a blur of tasks that allowed no room for reflection, though Celeste carried the earlier encounter like an uninvited weight. The servants' hall was alive with the constant shuffle of feet and the clatter of work. Brass sconces were polished until they caught every thread of light, and the scent of beeswax hung heavy in the air. She kept her head down, folding into the rhythm of her duties, willing herself to blend with the quiet industry around her. Near midday, she joined two of the senior maids in preparing a set of embroidered table runners. The long strips of linen were pressed beneath irons heated on the stove, the metal hissing softly as it met the damp weave. The older women worked in easy silence, but Celeste sensed their glances. Brief, sidelong, measuring. In the palace, news traveled in whispers, and she suspected that her arrival in the prince's apartments had already been noted. When one of them stepped away to fetch a replacement iron, the other leaned toward her companion, voice pitched just low enough to make the words feel furtive. The sound of Celeste's own name reached her before the rest was swallowed by the room's constant rustle. She bent closer over her work, pretending not to hear, yet the awareness prickled along her spine. From the kitchens came the mingled aromas of roasting pheasant and fresh bread. The cook's sharp instructions cut through the steady clink of utensils, and boys darted past carrying heavy trays, the warmth of the ovens radiating off their flushed cheeks. Celeste was sent to collect flowers for the dining hall, and she found the vases waiting in neat rows along a side table. She arranged them carefully, the stems bending beneath her fingers, releasing green, damp scents into the air. The banquet preparations threaded through every wing of the palace. Footmen moved in pairs to carry polished silver platters toward the grand dining room, where the long table gleamed under crystal chandeliers. On each place setting, the glassware was aligned so precisely that it seemed no human hand could have set it there. Celeste's own hands were steady as she set a folded napkin beside a goblet, though she felt as if the order of the room might fracture if she allowed herself to think too long about anything beyond the task. The unwritten rules here were as strict as the written ones. A servant's place was to exist in the background, unnoticed, yet she could not ignore the sense that eyes followed her more often than they should. She felt it in the brief hush of conversation when she entered a room, in the way the older staff looked from her to one another before returning to their work. The knowledge sat heavily on her. Any rumor could undo her. Late in the afternoon, with the last of the table linens collected for laundering, she moved through a narrow corridor lit by a string of wall lamps. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint tang of damp stone from the cellars beneath. She rounded a corner, her mind half on the laundry ahead, and stopped short. At the far end stood Prince Adrian. He was speaking in a low voice to a uniformed footman, his posture relaxed, but with the same undercurrent of authority she had felt in his apartments. The light from a nearby window traced a pale line along his shoulder, catching in the dark fabric of his coat. The footman, sensing her presence, glanced in her direction and murmured something to the prince before stepping aside. Adrian's gaze lifted to meet hers, and it was as though the corridor had narrowed. The faint, unreadable curve of his mouth returned, carrying no obvious warmth, yet holding something that drew her attention against her will. Without breaking eye contact, he started toward her, his steps unhurried but purposeful, each one soft against the worn carpet runner. Celeste's fingers tightened slightly on the wicker handles of the linen basket she carried. She could hear her own breathing, steady but shallower than before. The lamps along the walls cast overlapping halos of light that pooled and broke as he moved through them. When he reached her, he did not speak immediately. His hand came to rest briefly on the edge of the basket, the weight of his touch light but enough to halt her forward motion. The subtle scent of his cologne reached her again, sharper now in the close space. His eyes held hers, the kind of look that required acknowledgement, as though he expected her to answer a question he had not yet asked. Then, in a tone that brooked no dismissal, he told her to walk with him. The command left no room for hesitation. His tone was not sharp, but it carried the kind of certainty that made obedience feel inevitable. Celeste shifted the weight of the basket in her arms and stepped beside him, her pace adjusting to his without thought. They moved down the corridor together, away from the main passage and the soft commotion of the servants' work. Here, the air was cooler, tinged with the faint scent of old stone and the sharper note of polish from the wainscoting. The corridor narrowed, the high windows clouded with a pale film that blurred the view of the gardens beyond. Their footsteps echoed in unison, hers lighter, his deliberate, as if the very floor deferred to the rhythm he set. At first he spoke of the palace preparations, the visiting dignitaries, the demands of the evening, the precision required to maintain its image. His voice was smooth, almost casual, yet beneath it ran the same undercurrent she had felt before, a quiet persistence that hinted at some deeper intention. Gradually his questions shifted. How long had she been in Paris? Did she have family in the city? Where had she worked before? His gaze turned to her between steps, waiting for each answer with a patience that did not disguise its insistence. Celeste measured her replies carefully, giving him the truth only in pieces, small enough to hold without granting him the whole. She felt his attention on the spaces between her words as much as on the words themselves. The further they went, the quieter the palace became. The sounds of activity from the main halls thinned until there was only the muted toll of the afternoon bells in the distance. They passed tall doors closed against the day, the heavy drapes at their sides stirring faintly in a draught she could not place. The polished brass handles gleamed even in the dim light, a testament to the unseen work of the staff. They came at last to a tall, narrow door set into the stone, its paint slightly faded, the brass keyhole dark against the wood. Adrian opened it without ceremony and stepped aside for her to enter first. The air beyond was different, fresh, touched by the faint scent of damp earth and greenery. She stepped out onto a seldom-used balcony. The wrought iron railing curved gracefully, its black paint dulled by time. From here, the garden stretched out in careful symmetry, gravel paths winding between clipped hedges, the pale shimmer of the ornamental lake catching the afternoon light. Early buds had begun to form on the branches, promising the slow return of color after the winter's austerity. Adrian moved to stand beside her, his hands resting lightly on the railing. The setting sun had begun to tilt lower in the sky, casting a warm amber light that softened the hard lines of the palace stone. The glow caught on his profile, gilding the line of his cheek and the bridge of his nose. The quiet here was unlike the silence of the palace corridors. It felt less guarded, yet no less deliberate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze lifted a loose strand of her hair, carrying it briefly across her cheek, before letting it fall. Somewhere below, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel suggested a gardener crossing the path, though the hedges shielded the view. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the formality he often wore like a uniform. Yet the intent was still there, a measured persistence as he returned to his questions. Not about the palace now, but about her. Each was direct, and though she answered with the same caution as before, she could sense his awareness tightening around her restraint, as if every withheld truth confirmed that there was something to uncover. The sun's warmth touched her skin, and the air between them felt heavier despite the open space. She could sense his gaze even when she looked away toward the lake, a gaze that seemed to press for something more than she was willing to give. He shifted closer, the movement quiet but undeniable, and she felt the change in the air before she turned her head. His nearness was sudden enough to draw her focus entirely to him, the line of his shoulder brushing the edge of her sleeve. The faint scent of his cologne mingled with the breeze, sharper now in the closeness. His expression was unreadable, calm on the surface, yet with a depth that made her pulse quicken in spite of herself. His eyes searched hers in a way that was not merely observant, but intent, as if weighing what would happen if he closed the last measure of distance between them. Without warning, he lifted his hand toward her cheek. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as though he intended her to feel every second of the space closing between them. The curve of his hand moved into the light, the long fingers steady, the skin warm to gold by the lowering sun. The air around her seemed to thicken, the faint rustle of leaves from the garden below muted against the sound of her own breath. Celeste's pulse beat a hard, even rhythm in her throat. She could feel the pull of the moment, the way his presence reached for her before his hand ever did. The faint breeze lifted again, brushing the edge of her skirt against the iron railing, but even the cool air could not cut the heat that seemed to gather between them. He was near enough now that the shadow of his arm fell across her cheek. His expression was intent, eyes fixed as if reading something just beyond her gaze. She did not step back, though every part of her felt the instinct to do so. The open balcony behind her offered escape only in name. It would be a retreat scene, and perhaps interpreted, in ways she could not afford. Then, from the passage behind them, a sound broke through, the low creak of a door hinge, followed by the faint tread of approaching footsteps. Adrian's hand paused, hovering close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His head turned slightly toward the noise, the taut stillness in him shifting into something sharper. The footsteps grew clearer, measured but quick, until a figure appeared in the doorway. A valet in dark livery, bowing with a precision that suggested urgency. He announced that the prince's presence was required in the reception hall. The words hung in the air, formal and efficient, but threaded with enough weight to make Adrian step back. He straightened without haste, his gaze returning to her for one last measured glance. Whatever intention had driven him a moment earlier was folded neatly away, leaving no obvious trace save for the charge in the air that had not yet dispersed. The valet stood aside, waiting, and Adrian gave a brief nod before crossing the threshold back into the corridor. His movements were unhurried, but there was something in his stride that made it clear he had already set this moment aside for another time. Left alone, Celeste turned her eyes to the gardens again, as though their order and symmetry could steady her. The sky above the lake had deepened to a muted gold, and the first faint chill of evening pressed through the fabric of her dress. She let the breeze pass over her, willing her heartbeat to slow. She could still feel the nearness of him, not as a touch but as a presence, an imprint on the space where she stood. The muted sounds of the palace carried faintly from inside, the distant clink of silverware, the shuffle of chairs being moved into place for the evening's banquet. Stepping back from the railing, she moved toward the door and returned to the narrow corridor, retracing the path they had taken earlier. Servants hurried past, carrying trays and baskets, their eyes fixed on their tasks. She kept to the edge, slipping back into the pace of the palace, each step a quiet assertion of control she was determined to keep. By the time she reached the main service hall, the bustle had intensified. The ballroom was nearly ready. The crystal chandeliers above caught the light from dozens of candles, sending small constellations shimmering across the polished floor. The long tables gleamed under silver candelabra, their flames steady in the still air. Celeste joined the other maids in circulating through the room, replenishing champagne flutes and ensuring no detail was overlooked. She moved carefully, her expression composed, even as her mind replayed the interrupted moment on the balcony. The banquet began, the room filling with the hum of conversation and the low strains of music from a small ensemble. The scent of pheasant and rich sauces drifted from the sideboard, mingling with the perfume worn by the guests. As she worked, she was aware, though she never allowed herself to look directly, that Adrian was present at the head of one of the long tables, engaged in conversation with a foreign ambassador. Once, as she passed behind his chair carrying a fresh decanter of wine, her eyes met his briefly. There was no greeting, no movement that might draw notice, but the glance was deliberate, holding her for the space of a breath before she moved on. The evening stretched on, marked by toasts and courses served in careful succession. From her place at the edge of the room, Celeste saw the way the prince's attention would shift subtly, as if tracking her through the ebb and flow of the gathering. When the final toast was raised, crystal catching the golden light, the guests applauded politely before beginning to rise from their seats. In the shifting movement of the crowd, she caught sight of him again. Adrian stood, excused himself from the ambassador's company, and began to cross the room, straight toward her. The movement of the crowd seemed to part for him without effort, the shifting tide of silks and black coats bending subtly around his path. Adrian crossed the ballroom with the unhurried certainty of someone who never needed to press for space. His eyes never left her, and each step drew the air tighter in her lungs. Celeste adjusted the tray in her hands, though it was already empty, using the small act to steady herself. The hum of voices dulled against the sharper awareness of his approach. She could hear the faint rasp of his boots on the parquet floor beneath the overlapping murmur of guests exchanging farewells. Candlelight slid over his shoulders, gleaming faintly on the buttons of his coat and the smooth fall of dark hair above his collar. When he reached her, there was no pause, no courteous distance. His hand came to her arm, firm enough to guide, not so tight as to alarm, but without offering the possibility of refusal. She felt the pressure of his fingers through the thin fabric of her sleeve, the warmth that contrasted with the cool metal of the tray she still held. He steered her away from the nearest cluster of guests, angling toward a side door that opened into a quieter corridor. The noise of the ballroom receded behind them, replaced by the hollow acoustics of the narrower space. Here, the light came from wall lamps spaced far apart, leaving patches of dimness between them. The cool air carried a trace of damp from somewhere deep within the stone. Her footsteps were light against the floor's polished boards, his heavier, more assured. She could feel the measured pace he set, one that conveyed purpose but not haste. At the far end, he stopped, turning to place himself between her and the exit. The shadows softened the sharpness of his features, but his eyes held their same steady intensity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence between them felt deliberate, stretched until it pressed against her skin. Celeste kept her chin level, her hands still at her sides. The distance between them was no more than a pace, close enough that she could make out the fine stitching at the edge of his cravat, the faint gleam of gold on the signet ring he wore. His questions came without preamble, each one shaped to leave no space for evasion. Why had she chosen to work here? Who had recommended her? Did she know how easily one could be lost in the palace without ever stepping outside? His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of command. She answered as she had before, with precision, but little more than she wished to give. His gaze sharpened at the careful omissions, as though he recognized the boundary she was holding and was deciding whether to cross it. The air between them thickened until the faint sound of approaching footsteps broke it. A page rounded the corner, his quick movements bringing with them a draft of cooler air. He stopped abruptly, bowing before offering Adrian a sealed envelope. The thick cream paper bore no crest on its visible side, only the neat fold of the wax seal. Adrian took it without looking at the boy, who straightened and retreated the way he had come. The prince's eyes dropped to the letter for a moment, scanning the surface as though weighing its importance without yet breaking the seal. The change in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable, a tightening around the mouth, a fractional narrowing of the gaze. He slid the envelope into the inner pocket of his coat before lifting his eyes to her again. Whatever the letter contained, it had not lessened his intent. The line of his shoulders remained set, the focus in his expression undisturbed. Without offering explanation, he told her they were going somewhere else. His tone left no question of whether she would follow. He set the pace without haste, yet each step felt precise, carrying them deeper into the quieter reaches of the palace. The sound of their footsteps shifted as the corridor gave way to a wing where thick carpets muffled the tread. Heavy tapestries hung along the walls, the rich weaves depicting scenes of hunts and battles from centuries past. The air was warmer here, the silence heavier, broken only by the faint hiss of a draft moving somewhere behind the fabric. Celeste kept her eyes forward, taking in the subtle changes in the architecture. The darker wood of the paneling, the older style of the carved door frames. The scent of beeswax polish was stronger in this part of the building, as though the rooms were rarely disturbed, but still tended with meticulous care. She did not ask where he was leading her, knowing the answer would come in its own time, or not at all. They stopped before a door set slightly apart from the others, its varnish deepened with age. Adrian pushed it open and stood aside, a brief inclination of his head guiding her in. She stepped into a drawing room, lit by the low, steady flame of a single oil lamp on the mantel. The walls were paneled in dark wood, their sheen absorbing the light and casting the corners into shadow. Heavy drapes framed tall windows, drawn nearly closed against the night. The room smelled faintly of old paper and the sharper tang of polished brass. A pair of high-backed chairs sat angled toward the empty fireplace, and a long table stood against one wall, its surface bare, save for a small clock ticking evenly at its center. The stillness felt intact, as though it had been waiting for years to be disturbed. Adrian closed the door behind them with a soft click, the latch's sound carrying farther in the quiet than it should have. He began to move slowly around the room, his gaze traveling over its few furnishings as though reacquainting himself with them. Celeste remained near the center, her hands lightly clasped before her, aware of how her presence seemed to alter the balance of the space. When he came to stand in front of her, there was less of the overt proximity from earlier moments in the day. Yet the weight of his attention was no lighter. His eyes held her as if they were alone in a world measured only by this room's dimensions, and the silence between them was as deliberate as any question. She felt the shape of the moment shift. No longer the idle pursuit of conversation, but something more deliberate, more intent. Her heartbeat marked each second as he searched her expression, his own unreadable except for the quiet insistence behind it. The ticking clock on the table seemed louder now, marking the stillness like drops of water into a deep pool. Beyond the drawn curtains, the night pressed close to the glass, hiding the gardens and the rest of the palace from view. Before she could speak, a sharp knock at the door cut through the quiet. Adrian's gaze did not leave hers at once. The pause was long enough to feel weighted with a decision. Then he turned and opened the door just enough to address whoever stood outside. The voice was too low for her to make out the words, but his tone in reply was cool and controlled, tinged with a faint edge of displeasure. The exchange lasted only a few moments before he closed the door again. When he turned back to her, there was a different set to his expression, more resolute, as if something had just confirmed a suspicion. He crossed the space between them in a few measured steps, the lamplight catching on the line of his jaw, deepening the shadow beneath his cheekbone. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but certain, carrying no trace of hesitation. He told her that he had just learned something about her past, and that he intended to confirm it that very night. The room seemed to contract around his words, each one deliberate and heavy enough to linger. For a moment, Celeste stood without speaking, feeling the weight of the lamplight on her face, the faint warmth from the mantel drifting against the still air.
Adrian's gaze held hers, expectant but patient in the way of someone certain that time would yield the truth. He moved to the door and opened it fully this time, gesturing for her to follow. The corridor outside felt cooler, the change in temperature brushing over her skin like a breath of wind. They walked side by side, his stride measured, hers matched to his despite the questions coiling inside her. The deeper they went into the palace's outer wings, the quieter it became.
The muffled hum of servants at work faded to nothing but the low creak of wood underfoot and the faint rustle of Adrian's coat as he turned each corner. The sconces along the walls burned lower here, their light softening into a golden haze that left the edges of the hallway in shadow. A tall door opened onto the gardens. The night air was cool and damp, scented with turned earth and the faint sweetness of early blossoms. The moon cast pale light over the clipped hedges and the white gravel paths, making the ornamental lake shimmer faintly in the distance. They followed one of the narrower walkways, the crunch of gravel under their steps loud in the stillness. The garden walls seemed to shelter them from the world beyond, the high hedges forming corridors of their own. Adrian led her toward a smaller building nestled against the east side of the palace. A wing she recognized but had never entered. Its windows glowed faintly from within, and when he opened the door, the air shifted to the dry, aged scent of parchment and leather. Inside, the corridor was lined with shelves stacked from floor to ceiling. Volumes bound in worn calfskin leaned against bundles of tied letters, and the light from a few well-placed lamps cast long shadows between them. Their footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor, the sound absorbed quickly by the dense walls. Adrian stopped before a row of ledgers, scanning their spines with a practiced eye. His hand moved with certainty, pulling free a book whose edges were softened by years of handling. He carried it to a narrow table near the wall and opened it, the pages whispering as they turned beneath his fingers. Celeste watched as his gaze settled on a particular page. His finger traced a line of text until it paused, tapping lightly on a name written in precise fading ink, her family name. She stepped closer, the familiar letters stark against the aged paper, as if the years between had not dulled their power. The record was brief but unmistakable, a note of her father's involvement in a failed political uprising years earlier. The script was formal, impersonal, yet each word held the weight of consequence. She felt her breath grow shallow, the memory of whispered warnings from her childhood stirring in the back of her mind. Adrian looked at her then, his expression less sharp than before, though no less intent. The silence between them was different now, still taut, but threaded with something that might have been understanding. She told him the truth in measured words, that she had hidden this part of her life to protect herself, and to shield anyone connected to her from the danger it might bring. Her voice was steady, though the air felt thick in her lungs. He closed the ledger gently, the sound of the covers meeting soft but final. For a moment, he rested his hand on the worn binding, as if sealing the knowledge within it once more. His gaze remained on her, the lamplight catching in his eyes, making the gold within them glimmer faintly. The room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance, and the soft hum of the night air through the slightly open window. The gardens beyond lay still, the moonlight silvering the edges of every leaf. Nothing more was said. Yet something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the truth laid bare and the delicate balance it had shifted. The air seemed calmer now, though the distance between them remained measured, as if each was weighing what would come next. The first light of morning lay pale across the gardens, turning the dew into a scatter of silver drops. The mist clung low over the ornamental lake, drifting slowly in the still air. Inside the palace, the quiet hours before the day's full stir held a kind of suspended calm. Celeste moved through the long gallery, her steps soft against the parquet. The tall windows drew in the morning light, painting the floor in narrow bands of gold. Beyond the glass, lilacs had begun to bloom, their faint fragrance slipping in through an open pane. She carried a folded stack of table linens, the starch in them still sharp from the press, the scent of lavender water rising faintly with each step. Her mind was not on the linens. Fragments of the previous night moved through her thoughts. The pages of the ledger, the cool air in the archives. Adrian's gaze fixed on hers as the truth had been spoken aloud. There had been no promise in that moment, no threat either, only the certainty that the balance between them had shifted, though she could not yet see where it would settle. The sound of footsteps reached her, before she saw him. Adrian appeared at the far end of the gallery, his coat unbuttoned, the light catching faintly on the edges of the dark fabric. His presence changed the air as it always did, a quiet command that was felt before it was heard. They met in the center of the gallery, the silence between them carrying more weight than words. He looked at her as if measuring not what she would say, but what she would allow herself to feel. The pale light softened the lines of his face, catching on the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. Without speaking, he fell into step beside her, and they walked toward the far windows, where the gallery opened to a view of the east gardens. The gravel paths were still empty, the clipped hedges casting long shadows across the grass. A pair of white doves circled above the lake before settling on the balustrade, their feathers bright against the stone. At the last window she stopped, resting her hands lightly on the sill. The air drifting in was cool and clean, touched with the scent of lilacs. Adrian stood close enough that she could hear the sound of his breath, steady and even, as if he had chosen this moment for something he had carried in his thoughts for longer than he would admit. Their conversation began quietly, shaped by the kind of honesty that only comes when the usual barriers have been worn thin. They spoke of trust, of the cost of truth, of the ways life in the palace demanded silence even when silence came at a price. Her words were deliberate, but there was no attempt to hide the weight behind them. His responses were measured, his tone steady, yet she felt the sincerity in each one. The space between them closed, not abruptly, but with the slow inevitability of a tide. His gaze did not waver, and she found herself holding it without the instinct to look away. The sounds of the palace were distant here, muted by the thick walls and the early hour. Only the rustle of leaves in the garden broke the stillness. When he reached for her, it was without hesitation. His hand came to rest lightly against her cheek, the warmth of his skin a contrast to the cool air. She did not step back. Her breath deepened, though her posture remained steady. The faint trace of bergamot from his cologne lingered in the space between them, familiar now, though no less arresting. His eyes searched hers, not with the probing intent of earlier encounters, but with something quieter, more deliberate. The nearness carried no demand, only the weight of a choice offered. When his lips touched hers, it was not the taking he had once implied. It was an asking, one she answered without words. The contact was gentle at first, as if testing the truth of the moment, before deepening with the certainty of something neither of them had planned but both had reached. The warmth of it unfolded slowly, matched by the steadiness of his hand at her cheek, and the stillness of the gallery seemed to hold its breath around them. The world outside the tall windows went on unchanged. The mist lifting from the lake, the doves preening in the growing light, the lilacs swaying faintly in the breeze. But for them, the moment was complete, suspended, as if nothing beyond it could press its way in. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.